All right.
All right, so it's on record.
Okay, good. I got a tea refill.
Yeah, I got this actually interesting drink with like sour cherries that they make in Vietnam, and it's sort of like this cordial. I mean, it's non-alcoholic, but it's delicious. And yeah, sour cherries with sugar and ginger.
Sounds really good.
Yeah, it's hot here. Um, so it's nice with ice. So for people who are joining in, we are you should check out Mercedes's contributors page. So there's an interview there where Mercedes is talking about her work and conversation casual. Can we make this as casual as possible?
Yes. I feel like okay, wait. I have to turn my picture off again. I hold on. Hide self view. Okay.
Okay.
So much better. I feel like this is the beauty of a studio visit or like an independent studies when we were at CalArts. There's something just really nice about an exchange and a conversation that happens organically instead of it being a set of like questions. And it was funny because as you were talking about or asking me about my work and like the practice trajectory, I was remembering when we first started doing studio visits and what your work was like to this kind of final show, which I only saw um, in photograph because COVID, yeah,
Of course.
went out. But
Open March 16th, then we left March 11th, right?
yeah, and I was thinking about the kind of parallels between how we both went to undergrad into in kind of non-visual art fields and maybe how that influences, and then maybe talk about that kind of shift. Like there was a pretty big, I wouldn't say conceptual shift, but a like content shift. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think of it that way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a complete break because I did my undergrad at Wellesley, and actually I went to Wellesley because it was supposed to be known, so it's an all women's college, and it was known for politics, and I actually wanted to be a politician. I wanted to be a senator. So it was when we came from Yemen when I was 13, I was kind of really into government, into the idea of politics. I did presidential classroom. I wanted to kind of reshape laws. And during that time, so that was like sort of, 2001, of course, post September 11th. And then when I started college, which was 2004, this was a time of like Abu Ghraib and seeing how language was, first of all, sort of like how language was abducted, essentially, so Arabic, the word that we have for student is talib or taliba, right? Which can then be kind of carried over to Taliban, which is a terrorist group, right? The word for madrasa, if you type it into Google even now, comes out as this terrorist training camp, right? So these,
Yeah, I remember that sitting in your studio and you showing me the Googling those words in the Arabic and then the English, even in the, was it the changing the font that you were using? And the images that came out were entirely different, right?
yeah,
Do you,
completely. Yeah, that's exactly it. So if you type it in as an Madrassa, the transliteration of it, or even being a little bit more forgiving using one S, then it comes up all these images of children who are in this sort of fanatical context, Muslim context and mostly boys, and that it's this religious training camp. But when you type it in mim darra sin ta marbuta, which is in the Arabic form, and you type in school, then you just see kind of elementary school, right? You just see kids. People may not even be, it's not even Muslim. I mean, it's just like, so, we got to know each other in a madrasa. It's the only word that we have for school. And same for student. And I saw how this sort of language was propagandized and abducted, so much so that even the even the possibility of the space in which we can use it. Even to this day, we can't use them in the airplanes, right? Or in places of transport, because even last April, not this April, but the one before, people were being pulled out of, a woman was pulled off of an airplane because she had a book about Syrian art and it was written in Arabic. Um, and so, when your language becomes such a threat and it becomes a weapon, and thinking back about the politics, I realized that if I continued in law and politics, I was actually about navigating language. And being the child of two linguists, I realized it's not language translation of it or the manipulation of it, is really about whose agenda is it trying to fulfill. And so I started getting quite interested in filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, and I realized then that I really wanted to produce a sort of objective story, right, or narrative, and of course that's impossible, right, because whatever you pick, it's your choice and what you choose to put in, so it becomes actually very subjective. And I took 10 years off, moved to Morocco. Excuse me, I moved to Morocco and was actually working in arts administration. So I was working for the Marrakesh Biennial for a little bit, for TEDx Marrakesh. And I found during that process, it was really helpful, but I really hated it. And I hated it because, you kind of, you're my job was basically to try to figure out where money was coming from, trying to find permits, like trying to negotiate different language, particularly in a place like Morocco where there's like French, Arabic, Amazigh, Darija. And and I decided at one point that I was actually really looking for, I thought money was happiness.
Hmm.
I thought money was comfort. Money is what gave comfort. And I guess as a child of immigrants as well, this is what, who's also a scholarship kid, for the entire time of my education, that I had to kind of work and kind of build that comfort for myself so my parents could kind of live and retire
Mhm.
happily. But what I ended up realizing was that a mentor told me that if I really try to look for what makes me happy and kind of fulfill what makes me happy, that money will come, right? It's not about. So I took a long trip to kind of ward off what, to kind of re-examine what did comfort mean to me. And it was 100 days, where I went to the places. I was really miserable, actually. So to went to the places that I wanted to go to before I died. So you can imagine the thoughts that I was having. So I went to Mongolia. I went to Pemba Island in Zanzibar, and it was me and my camera, and I was going on $20 a day, which in some places, but that included flights. And I went for 100 days and I photographed and just tried to get used to using the camera again, because I thought if I wanted to go into film, I really had to understand the single frame.
Mhm.
And I think that shift, in that time, that was really significant, those 100 days, because it also made me realize how I really had to let go of what people thought of what I had to do, or what was expected of me. Um,
Expectations.
yeah, of expectations. And also, like, when you're making art making is really about risk taking, and I think you can understand that as well. You were mentioning that in, when we were having a conversation about your work, about, when you moved away from photography, how some people really weren't crazy about that idea and others were. um and so I got sort of into this rhythm of kind of working with textiles and photographs, and that's actually why I came back to do my graduate studies, because I wanted a space to break that, because I actually found that my work was becoming quite redundant, even though the themes, and I have also, even though I kind of moved away from language, written language, my writing still is really important. And even though the statements were so significantly different, but the work seemed to be very similar. And so, working with you and working with other people, at Cal Arts, like Ashley Hunt and Colleen Smith, for example, was really, it kind of shook that, right? It allowed me to kind of deconstruct my own practice and kind of, and break out of just making photographs.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's sometimes this idea, especially when you grow up, maybe idealizing security, especially financial. Like I grew up the same way, where it feels like there's some formula, right? Like you just kind of have to crack this code. And the thing about an art practice and art making, I feel like there is no there is no code, but like there's, if you have your core, like if you keep your core and like let go of like the formula, so many interesting things can come to the surface.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that's kind of, it's interesting that that you felt that even before coming to school. I mean, it kind of speaks to this idea of like how necessary is graduate school. And I know for myself, it completely transformed my ability to kind of think and kind of extricate meaning. But I feel like you, in particular, of a lot of the people I worked with, really transformed. And it wasn't like we were having a completely different conversation at the end. And I know I was only there a year and a half of the 2 years, but it wasn't like we were having a completely different conversation at the end. But the work had shifted quite a bit, and it felt like, um, yeah, I felt like it's kind of like an odd question, but like, how do you think that worked for you? Like, was there a letting go? Was there like, was it a moment, or was it organic, or like, because it's kind of like the thing you always wish for, like even myself in my practice, like how, like the evolution, like the progress, like maybe it's too esoteric to speak to, but I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think that that actually one of the reasons that I came to school was because of the type of work that I was making. I was really commenting. I was sort of hitting at the edge of things about identity without, without actually diving into really what was so unsettling for me. It was almost like afraid to look into the light because you're going to get blinded, right? So you kind of look at all the things that are around it. And for me, it was really about Yemen. And I didn't know, there's also this responsibility. Sometimes we talk about it as it for artists, like, is it a burden is it a responsibility to talk about the traumas of where we come from, right? Because with that you have to then do the labor, and like we were talking and about your work, where you have to go through and explain, but you also have to dig and you see people who are like yourself, right, who could be your brother, your sister, your nieces, your children, um dead. And so it really, in August when I started, there was the Lockheed Martin, there was the bombing of school children on a school bus in Lahyan, Yemen. And it was a mistargeted Lockheed Martin bomb that was that was shot on the Saudis, who the United States is an ally to them. And I really, at that moment, was sort of kind of the point of departure. So the first year I really, and that's when we were kind of getting to this conversation, and I really kind of lost it, which I think is even a privileged place to be, because I'm not in the middle of the conflict,
Mhm.
right? And I somehow wanted to insert myself in a different way, but also to kind of reveal what is happening and how complicit actually United States citizens are in their paying of taxes to this parasitic relationship with Yemen, where many Americans don't even know where it is, right? And what does it happen, for me to be as a US citizen, but also a Yemeni, and how do I exist on the border rather than on either side of it? And it felt like during that time, kind of trying to, even the news wasn't really commenting, and the news still doesn't comment about Yemen, because it's exactly, what you were talking about, like, wow, well, that sucks that that's happening to these kids. But of
Right.
course, over there, you know what I mean? But there are all these problems in all these other places. And I understand that, because there are children on the border right now who are still, even with the pandemic, who are being, who are in these camps, literally, and when we're thinking about children and people who don't even have clean water in Flint, Michigan, and who are being poisoned with it, when you think about, you know, Black men and women who are being killed in their sleep, of course, why are you going to care about what's happening in Yemen when we even talk about healthcare? And so how do you make that relevant, but also how do you not aestheticize? And my work is a lot about aesthetics, or it was, right? And how do you not aestheticize war? And so during that, for me, I think that shift was kind of, it started, my studio became this mapping of trying to figure out what is happening, who is in charge, what is, like, who's in charge of what's, yeah, who are the victims, who are the culprits. And of course, and after naming all of them, it also comes down to me. And I think at that moment, I came at the end of the first year with the conflict is more profitable than peace, and with my mid-residency with that film, I kind of reached a wall. I was blocked, and I didn't know where to go with it. And I think some of that was also, there are a lot of things that you can't unsee. So a lot of these images, and I can't, um, but where do you go? And I think that last summer, I was really interested in futurism and Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism, and also working with you, thinking about what does it mean to be indigenous and be about part of a tribe in Yemen, right? And how does that, what are the politics there, and how some of those actually really relate, and just the vocabulary around it, right? Just because the British aren't in Yemen, what is the new colonizer, right? And is the land actually ours? And is it ours if we can't even survive because we don't have food and aid, because that's being blocked? So who owns it from afar? The people who are controlling the drones. And so that actually, the shift happened in the summer when I was reading Sun Ra and Octavia Butler, and thinking about, Hisham Blasem, and looking at the work of Michael Rakowitz, who also got to come and visit, and seeing how, Mariam Banani's work, how different futurists kind of deal with things. And I'm particularly critical about what Arab futurism is, because it sort of orientalizes as well, makes Yemen a part of this. It ignores our individualism, right? Our individuality, like in our traumas. And I think so, kind of, I decided to kind of start looking at Yemeni futurism. And I think there was this, and creating, and what does it look like? And I think the Alan Sekula grant really helped me do that, because I got to connect with people in Brooklyn, particularly Iman Ahmed and Awad Ghazali, who's in Detroit, and looking at these communities and what is it that as Yemenis we have in common. And that was amazing. That was incredible. And from that, I just started allowing myself freedom, right, to start to reconstruct what could the future look like. And it all came from a myth, right? But a myth, like a story, like that we believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, a story that we believe, and that's kind of considered this myth. But also, it's like, what are myths, and what are stories, and whose history is that, and what does it mean when there's an erasure that happens? What is it that replaces it? Because things will change, right? So trying to give life and voice again to these stories, especially as we come from an oral history where we don't write, we share, we carry. Even our law, qabila, there are 3 laws in Yemen, and the law that's followed by the tribes is an oral one. It's unwritten. So trying to kind of animate and give life to these, very much like how you were talking about, and that came through manifested in different ways, which was like, if this time it came back through film, so it's through a lot of layering. It was through language and invention, like trying to invent a new language. So yeah, and still kind of using textile, but in this case also not documenting other people's or other communities' patterns, not even my own patterns of my tribe and like my heritage, but actually creating my own patterns for the future, from the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think about in the when you're kind of like addressing these like atrocities and trying to kind of be like, look at this, like this is not 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, it's now, right? And in a way where it shifted was, it was almost like the first impulse is like to use the person you're trying to reach as logic or symbols or methods, like to mirror it, right? So you're like, oh, I'm just gonna kind of give you this thing that you can understand because you understand this language or these set of symbols or this methodology of internalizing something. And I think what's kind of amazing about where you got to was you no longer felt that obligation to use the same not logic, maybe logic patterns, but method. And so it's kind of this idea that you're expecting, like we were talking about it, earlier, the other person to do work. So you're not just giving everything in like a explicitly laid out perfect way. There's these moments where you have to kind of do the work of understanding. And I think that that's kind of shifting a position of power, right? It's taking this position where you're asking for people to kind of see something versus showing them in a way that is inescapable. And yeah, so I feel like that was.
No, I appreciate you saying that, absolutely, because I think that's what the two films are. So the first one, Conflict is More Profitable Than Peace, is gathering, it's mapping, and it's even
Mhm.
like introductions of like these gestural interventions of a series called Under Thread, where I wrap myself in thread and still kind of like notating that I do come from this practice of using thread and textile, but what happens when all of that is washed away and it deteriorates, and what does it mean to unravel, to actually see the human beneath it, which is what most viewers really want from my other work, of these kludes that are covered in fabric, who's beneath it, and in this way I'm revealing it. But I think also that whole first year was the labor that I was doing for other people. And it was a way, I think artists actually, for me at least, I see the role of the artist is to hold a mirror up to society. And for me, it was this was a way of holding this mirror up and saying, this is how you see Yemen. This is everything that I have found. This is how I see myself, which is even worse, right? I'm not seeing images of the beautiful dragon blood trees. I'm not seeing it of these gorgeous, known for the first skyscrapers in the world in Shibam, Yemen, this incredible terrain, the terraced mountains. This is what I grew up. I don't see this reflected in the media at all, not even within Arab media. And so what I see are limp bodies and I see starving bodies, and I see these images that are so ingrained that's when people come to me, they ask about Yemen, they're these eyes of pity, and without except for those who acknowledge that you've come for such an exquisite and incredible, ancient, we're not Bedouin either. It's not like we're a nomadic. We've been there for thousands of years, and all Arabs come from 7 tribes that originated in Yemen. And so people are the first to say, oh yeah, our ancestors are from Yemen, but they'll turn their head away and not help Yemenis. And so when you think about, that was that. And so the second part was more about, rather than mirror, it was the mirror to how, it was almost like a window, for the Mahjad, for the film, of this is how Yemenis see ourselves. And this is how we would like to see ourselves. And this is how we imagine ourselves, and thinking about the Red Star and tying in and having this freedom to be, to express these stories and to express it in color, and the difference even in the color between them. The other one is basically redacted. Rather than redacted documents, there's actually highlighted it's all highlighted, and it's black and white, whereas the other one is very colorful and layered.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in a certain sense they create this really nice balance between each other because when I think about the Notebook video, in a lot of ways it feels like clearly presented in a way that I'm like, I can sit and experience this and learn something, and also know that I'm being told something important. and internalize it. And then I think about how you use almost the same sort of documents with like the article on Mars. Well, maybe I'm referencing a video that people haven't seen. But anyway, you use like these kind of official documents and later work in a way that reflects, like it reflects back into the same impulse, but it also kind of takes it into this realm of absurdity. And in a lot of times, especially in like this current moment when I hear the words coming out of our president's mouth, I feel like I'm living in this absolute moment of absurdity where I'm like, this can't be real, right? And so I feel like this kind of moment where like truth becomes odder than fiction, right? Like where like you're kind of, and in the same breath you're kind of referencing this huge history, right? This very specific interest, like specifically interested stories and myths, and connecting that in a way that seems impossible to connect to like a news story about a lawsuit against the ownership of Mars that happened. What year was it? I mean, the last 5 years, right?
It was in 97.
Okay, so a little further back, but still, like,
Yeah.
this trajectory of time and space. And, I know we were talking about in mind how you're kind of like searing through layers of understanding. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, go ahead.
No, no. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I guess. I mean, this is also something interesting because actually, the film, people who are probably seeing this, will not actually be able to see the film, the Mahjar film, and I think that's also a choice that I made. But it will be shown and occasionally streamed through the Benton Museum, which I'll be exhibiting in starting in September for an entire year. They extended it because of COVID, and one of the reasons why is because Mahjar ended up becoming so precious, right? It becomes this culmination of stories that are um, and of histories and of migration actually, of different people that I really wanted to honor, and I really wanted the space that it's shown to again not be abducted and for it to be shown the way that we wanted. And I found that even like working, for example, on these kind of contributions with Arts Cabinet, it's been very difficult because the platform has been so inflexible. And it kind of goes to how is it easier for to sort of encase this film, right? And that's why conflict is more profitable than peace. It shows on there, but the other one, Mahjar, hasn't because I refused to. There were discussions about really trying to use the whole space and reimagine this white space, like this white space which is on this site that is in a grid that is very specific into how it needs to be put, and it needs to be in English words, and the difficulty of trying to get the Arabic words and not being able to format it, which was kind of introduced very differently to me, and without that flexibility, I don't want to make a film that is going to fit within a set paradigm, which is what I feel like I have to do in terms of my identity all the time. I always have to kind of think about, and that's one of the reasons why I think being an artist really wasn't a choice, because I wanted to create, and I think for many artists, to create my own space in which how I exist, how my work exists, and how it's being presented. And just like a little background on this film, it really ties into this story of the ancient Sabaeans and Queen Balqis of Sheba, Malikat Balqis from Saba. And Saba was believed to have been, it is Yemen and it was Ethiopia. And we believe that Queen Balqis, her throne was in Ma'rib, Yemen. And that at the time she was the most powerful ruler of the region, and there was a sorcerer or a great wizard who was from far away who is believed to have been King Solomon, who wanted to visit her because he heard of her power. And she asked for a gift, for him to come and bring a gift the size of her power. and he brings her the red star. And from that point on, there was a destruction and sort of the invasion of Yemenis. And I really fast forward. So when we were growing up, we would, and when I spoke to Iman and when I spoke to Awed, we all knew of this red star, and we all had different imaginations of where this red star was. Was it a fictional place? Was it Venus? Was it, Mars? And and then in 1997, these three Yemeni tribesmen tried to sue NASA because NASA had actually sent up the Sojourner Pathfinder to explore and to discover Mars. And they tried to sue them for invading their inherited land, which they inherited 3,000 years ago. And I thought that was an interesting point of departure, because what does it mean in this time of like futuristic colonization, where when if you look at Mars at the moment, it's already mapped out, and it's mapped out with, Eurocentric names. Of the scientists basically who have been exploring that. So, and they're drilling in to see if it's a place to create colony. And so, bringing in stories of the spider and bringing in all these, these different elements to it, I think it requires something more precious, and the labor that's been in. So I think space needs to work around these stories and around the history of us, rather than us continually trying to navigate around these restrictions, even if it's a website. So I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation instead.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it's like something I think that experience brings. I feel like when you're first engaging in the art world and your art practice, it's like you just want everybody to see everything, because isn't that the point? And kind of what you realize, or what I came to realize, was that yeah, there are certain modes of dissemination of art and materials that functions differently. I have bodies of work that are not on my website. I have um, images that I've made that only exist in certain places, who I won't sell. I had somebody once ask me for my work that was like Indian feathers, etc. And I was like, this photograph will not exist in your realm of experience, because it
That
was dismissive. So I think it's a kind of really important thing to understand, of like where something is meant, and how really controlling how it's meant to be experienced. Uh,
absolutely.
Especially when you're talking around things that are sensitive, or like you said, precious. And I feel like sometimes that you said precious, correct? Is that
Yeah.
it is? And I feel like sometimes we think of that as, I don't know, I think of those like precious moment statues. I don't know, did like any of your crazy aunts ever have like a collection of those? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No idea.
Horrible porcelain things with like these kids with huge eyes, and they're all called like, I don't know,
Precious moment.
precious moment. That's what they're called. So like, I don't like. I think that it's not about it being infantilized. It's the idea that not all information or stories or modes of giving are for everybody. I think that that's a very hard thing for some people to internalize. Um, I don't know if
Yeah.
you deal with that, but where people are like, why shouldn't I have access, right? But then when you think about what an entitled position that is, um, yeah, it's a super privileged, entitled position to think that you should have access to everything. And I'm not talking about this specifically. I'm talking about just like cultural information,
Well,
history,
absolutely.
mythologies. Like, did you deal with that at all? And kind of, I mean, I know you're working in this kind of ancient ideas of language and symbologies, and kind of beginning to paint and kind of make marks that aren't with a photograph. So I don't know, is that
No, I mean, I think actually I was even gonna talk, and just to go reference right back to what you were saying in terms of like about accessibility. So not only how things are presented. So one of my mentors from college, David Tang Olson, who's also a phenomenal artist, told me that the work only really begins when it's on the wall or in the room. So we think that we're done with the work once we bring it into like the gallery space or the exhibition space. But in fact, that's also where where the work also begins, because it's once it's out of you, it's out of the studio, and that's where you see how people interact with it. And so how it's presented is so important. It's not just to tag it, to just make sure, check, we've covered this region, right, or we've got an artist from here, or somebody's talking about this conflict. And I think then it also exists on another level in terms of, I mean, for example, where do you want to show the work? Who's on the board of that? Who's going to be, and sometimes that's a difficult one, because I still show where I can, but I think sometimes we can make those choices. And it's the same in terms of what you even include in the work itself, like with the film, when I would have studio visits with you and with other people. I mean, for example, or with EJ Hill, who was also an incredible mentor during these years. I would get completely different responses from you, from different people, because the access was completely different. And so an Arabic speaker would have a different experience about the Mahjar film than you would, but also you as an indigenous person who would understand, and kind of certain things that you would pick up on. But also, and speaking even also like with EJ, and also EJ's, really kind of explaining, I'm okay to know that that's not for me. That I can never understand what that trauma is, or what that narrative is. And then also that language, that it's not that I don't understand, but I can understand what is happening, and I can go on my own journey of it. And what does this idea of migration, of unchosen, right, migration, and what does that mean to be exiled, to be, to be a migrant, to be a refugee? I mean, all these kind of conversations that really lead to different types of intimate experiences with different individuals. And I think that's also where there was a moment where I wanted to kind of start from a different slate. And when I was having these conversations, when people were saying, well, I need it all to be translated, and I need it all to be subtitled in English, because I need this, I can't understand, so I can't critique you, and we can't have a studio visit because this is not for me. Or the way that I would tell these stories, um, and narrate the stories in the film, people told me that, well, this doesn't sound very like native English. Would you like me to re-edit it for you so that it sounds like native English? And only because it was just a long, drawn out and more poetic. And I remember coming to these sort of assumptions of what it should be, as opposed to what I could create from my roots and from my heritage. And so, and all of those instances were very helpful, because there were moments for me to say, okay, I've thought about it, and I'm happy with you not understanding it. That's where you need to meet me. And I think that's also what got me into this idea of language, because I really wanted to rid the film about from religious and political, because also what is Yemeni language? Well, it's Arabic, but it's also Hebrew, right? And I'm not talking about it only about as a religion, but as a culture. And what happened when Yemenis also even went to Israel, and the diaspora went, and children were abducted from their families and put with Ashkenazi white families to be re-educated. Um, and so this is just, what does it mean to also be including the Yemeni diaspora into this from all over? And so I wanted to include Hebrew, Arabic, but also ancient Sabaean, which would be the language of Belqis, which was which was before that, religions had, those, I mean, she prayed to the sun, so those religions had entered Yemen. And so through being inspired through these different languages, and listening to them, it was really amazing. Remember, did I play for you the ancient Sabaean?
Yes, totally. Yes.
That was insane. That was
Yeah.
insane for me, because it's written and it looks very much like Hebrew, and but when you hear it, my father and I could understand it, and it felt like I could just, it was, I mean, I said it before, it was like my roots, it was just kind of vibrated at every edge of my body. It was insane. And I suddenly felt like my soul had really extended 3,000 years. So I wanted to include that. And so now, in the time of COVID, because of this new installation that's coming up, I usually upholster rooms. And so the tactility of like my work is really important, but now people can't touch things. And so we had to have this long conversation about fabric and whether or not we could include fabric, um, because of the tactility of it. And so now I'll actually be painting, and so muraling, and yeah, so we'll see how it goes. And there's also an element of light, which when we were talking about your work, how this will be sort of a multi channel installation that's projected through windows, so the film can actually be seen at all hours, even at night, from outside of the building and from inside. And only at night do you really see how the lights, the black light really activates the fluorescence, to make it feel like a starship as I'm in, but it'll be different like this, but also to just really feel like another world, because there is no place. I mean, Yemenis can't really, I've gotten into so many conversations with you when we're talking about migration, right? I didn't even ask you this, but like when we're talking about migration, how could you think about migration when you haven't really migrated from your land?
Right. To feel so unwelcome or ostracized from a place you're actually physically in, that living on another planet seems much more one attractive, feasible, and possible, right?
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
Not thinking about it on a horizontal, but starting to imagine it on a different plane, which is more vertical.
Yeah. And yeah, no, the migration thing is interesting. It makes me think of that really beautiful moment. If I don't know if you want to speak that when, go ahead. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, go for it. Go for it. I don't know what you're talking about, but you can totally talk about it.
Is the I'm not, I don't remember the exact word of like looking, like knowing that was the last time you were going to see your homelands.
Oh, yeah.
Like for some reason that always stuck with me. That kind of, yeah. I don't know. Maybe you can.
Yeah, this was actually an interview that I had with Awad Ghazali, who left Yemen, several months into the war. And there's this whole story, because also that's another one that people talk about, the refugees. And when there was, the movement of Syrians going
Mhm.
into Europe, it could have also been Yemenis, but they couldn't because they were blocked. And so many Yemenis go to Djibouti. And I'd asked Awad, who really, I'm so grateful for, because he trusted me, and I think that's also that you kind of come into this, for the lack of a better word, like a contract, right? Like we were talking with Azaleh, right? With Ariel Azaleh, how she talks about that social contract, that you're really responsible for these stories they tell. And for him, I asked him, what was the last thing that you saw of Yemen? And he really narrates this beautiful but also heartbreaking moment of when he gets onto the ship, and disembarks from the port. And the last thing about the 20 minutes in that he sees is the light. And when the light disappears, he's sort of in the unknown. And he uses these words, of like ship, safina, and majhul, and like what does it mean just to go into the unknown? And that could, even thinking about that on these two planes, thinking about what it means to go horizontally into a country, the United States, possibly. He didn't know if he was going to Italy or He had no idea what was, but then coming to the United States, where actually Yemenis are still on the Trump's ban list. And I find that's quite interesting right now, as the United States, as we are being banned in other places, like in Europe, because of how terribly we're dealing with COVID, right? And so that's interesting. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but yeah, this and finally for him to come here, and actually throughout during the film, he got his papers to be here, and he started a business which actually imports Yemeni objects and food for. So, and I thought that was also interesting. It could be its own film, because what does it mean for us to be here to create Yemen for ourselves? And when people say, "Oh, you're here to, this idea of assimilation. Does assimilation mean that now you have to forget your language, you have to speak English? Sure. Okay, I believe that you should speak the language of wherever you are, right? And like try to, if make an effort. But also, does that mean that you forget your food, and that do you forget like the smells and the incense, and that the way that we seat ourselves, right? We seat in mafrages and diwans. Does that mean that all of that changes? Is that what assimilation means? And if so, I don't want to be a part of that.
I mean, I would argue that that's the impulse of assimilation, but I would also counter that that's impossible to forget, right? Like those smells of childhood, those tastes, like those moments, they never leave your body. I mean, maybe you need something to trigger it again, which is like the beauty of this idea of bringing these tastes and smells to people who are dislocated physically from their homeland. But I don't think it ever actually leaves you.
Right.
Like it's like maybe it's internal memory or body memory, but it never leaves. So I mean, I think assimilation always kind of has this impulse of like sever the religion, the spirituality, the customs, the culture, the family structures, the food, that's its purpose, right? To like sever all of those facets, but I really don't think it's capable. This is incredibly tangential, but I am constantly dealing with this population of swallowtail butterflies that eat anise in my backyard.
Oh, beautiful. Oh my
So
God,
they come
beautiful.
through, they lay the eggs in the anise. They turn into these like caterpillars, like so tiny. I watch them grow into larger caterpillars. I've watched them go through this whole process. And I've never been that connected to butterflies as I don't know. It hasn't been like the thing that caught my attention, but it's made me kind of think through some things and talk to people about it and study. And the amazing thing is when they migrate, the same butterfly doesn't actually make it entirely through the whole journey. But when they actually pass down genetic memory to their offspring of how to get where they're going.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
This idea that you can
Oh
pass
gosh, that's
on
beautiful.
this this ancestral knowledge
Totally. Yes.
that you can inherit that
Oh,
with, and this is like a really like um literal outcome of that,
right.
right? Where to go next, literally.
Right.
But it's and the other thing that's fascinating is in that stage of the chrysalis, they completely dissolve. They completely transform from one thing to another. So it's actually passed down at like the cellular level. Um,
Oh my God, that's incredible and really beautiful.
yeah. So it's like you think of these. I don't know that story that he told of like watching those lights disappear, and going to the unknown. Like it always just like seared into me because it was this moment of recognition and like camaraderie, even though the culture is so different, the geography is so separated. Like it's not about, there was just something in the essence of it that felt so that longing
Yeah.
so present, that kind of understanding of never really being able to literally maybe ever physically reconnect, but what does it mean to hold all of that genetic ancestral cellular information and knowledge like within your being, and even have the potential to pass that down if that is what you decide to do. It's just a um yeah, I don't know, that always stuck with me,
And
that
I
part.
think that I think that that's I'm so happy to hear that. And I think that part is, I mean, that when people were moved, when people would watch it, those who were really moved by it, I mean, to tears,
Mhm.
um, had experienced really, I mean, this really weighted word of diaspora.
Hmm.
It's not just a word. It's such a heavy, heavy word. And what does that mean? What does it mean to, like, what is it that we choose to bring with us? What is it that we can't bring with us? What is it that we want to, um, kind of erase, right, and put to the side? And what are the things that are imposed in the new place that replaces all of those, right? And that you're trying, you're trying to push out. And so I do understand what it means when people come and from different parts, and they just want to keep everything like it was, because that space that is rejected, it gets filled in with something else. And a lot of the times that thing that gets filled in actually sees you as the enemy, right? Or sees you as a threat.
And it's also those pieces that, you see this in a lot of immigrant communities of like maybe a generation or two before, where it's
Right.
what is inescapably impossible to get rid of, right? I think of things that like my grandparents did who were indigenous, but they very much tried to assimilate in their lifetimes. But then these like little like things peeked through. Where I was like, as a child, I didn't know how to understand it because it didn't make sense. It was like even as a child, I knew it didn't make sense. But then when I finally understood where its origin was, I was like, oh, that's why they did that, or this is why this happened, or now this story makes so much more sense. So even in this impulse to completely wipe and just kind of mask as like, how one was supposed to in the 1950s, um, it was impossible.
Exactly. 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 And I think there's also a moment, which I think that's why it's also been really amazing having you as a mentor, because, you know, I remember having this conversation, like, what happened, and how did it happen with, I mean, how do you even exist? Like, thinking, how can you live knowing you're on your land, knowing that this is your land and that you can access it, right? Or like it's been taken and stolen. And of course, I think about this with Palestinians, right? I think about this in different regards. And then in terms of Yemen, what does it mean that, of course, when I go back, if I go back, it will not be the same. And how do I create, collectively with people, and that's also difficult, like trying to kind of find, when you're trying to think about futurism, um how do you how do you bring the Yemenis also together to start thinking about that? Because it's also, and what could it look like? And I think that's why it was really amazing working with Iman and Awad, because they were actually still so tied, even though, and Iman was born in the United States, she's been here all of her life, and yet, what is it that we still have that I can walk into her house and just feel like I'm back in Yemen, and feel like I'm definitely in a Yemeni house, or exactly the foods, and what does it mean to create that constellation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to thread us together. And and then some of the complications, like, what, even among different indigenous groups here, right? And even among Yemenis, and how different Yemenis kind of may see kind of the facts as different. And I think that's also, I think, what I'm excited about doing next year. So, this coming year, I'll be doing this residency in Roswell, New Mexico, which is actually quite isolated. And I'm kind of interested in going into a place of isolation and further isolation, I guess, than this, in order to start really imagining, like, the present already being the past, and almost, placing myself already into the future. And what is that potential? Because it's exhausting. It's exhausting to revisit trauma. And it's not, and there's this, and I have to be honest, it's not, I mean, we lived through the war in Yemen, but it was nothing compared to what's going on right now. And so what, which I've been very privileged to not be there, but what is this need for constantly trying to give back, and not sure when you're giving back, at times being very careful, right? Where does money go? I think people are kind of always at this, how do we get money there, and how do we help people? And I think there are ways, and I've kind of figured them out through my individual family, but it's tricky. So thinking about how culture, rather than this monetary Why, how can culture create a shift and an awareness, and bring beauty to it so that people are also interested in looking at it, but then confronted with the reality. That was a bit tangential, sorry, but yeah.
I was going to ask about the residency too, and like what you thought or how you're thinking around that, because it's like going from a graduate program where you're just constantly, for better or for worse, surrounded by other people. It's like this, crush of interaction, to going to a space that's really the opposite of that. And it makes me think about, ideas of community, ideas of how you said, you can walk into the living room and feel at ease. Like, so what creates, like, what are the environments and interactions that create a sense of that, like, breath out that sometimes we can feel? Sometimes there's something about navigating institutional spaces where you are often put in that position of being the sole voice or the sole brown body or the sole representative of a history or a trauma or a ongoing travesty or whatever you want to call it, um, ongoing trauma. When you're constantly that voice and that person, it's like you're operating in a level of like tension and holding your breath constantly. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see really the space that you do create and how you kind of, um, navigate when those who surround you are chosen. um, I mean, I think sometimes the beauty of being in a grad program or any kind of school environment maybe is that you can't, sometimes you're challenged by the interactions in a good way. And I think that that's really healthy for people. Um, but it's also, you know, exhausting sometimes, you
Yeah,
know.
I think I was kind of fortunate because in terms of like the grad, I mean, I don't know, I came in kind of very clear of what I wanted to pull out of it, and the relationships with people that I wanted, yeah, the people that I wanted to build these relationships and what I wanted to try, and also being kind of flexible with it. But I think I think particularly for women, I'm not talking about artists, but just in general, I think women should really spend, I mean, at least a few months traveling by themselves
Um,
safely. But I mean, I think there's this moment of being able to get to know oneself, um, and be comfortable and like never have the opportunity to be bored, to like, what does it mean to fill your time with, and be curious, right? And what are you curious about, and what is it that you want? And I found when I did it the first time, and sometimes that could be escapist, right? But in this regard, I think I'm really interested in, I think what happens in, Harry Gamboa, who is also, from Cal Arts, and who was also quite influential in many of these discussions, particularly in the first film, said that if we do our job well, then you will have enough ideas from grad school that will last you for 20 years or more. And that was kind of said in the first few classes that I had with him, or meetings. And I, this, there's so much time, there's so much conversation and so much space, that there became ample amount of ideas to develop, even in the creation of this film, that I had to set aside and say, this is its own project. I'm sure happens to you, like, this needs more time to process. This can be developed in a different way. It doesn't all have to be kind of put into one thing. And so I think working on that, and I think what I'm most excited about is developing this kind of invented language. And in Mahjad is the first time that I also speak it in there. So I'd like to keep developing that, but also being flexible to allow it to process, because 2 years of grad school, I mean, I think 3 is always the ideal, right? Or more, but I mean, just to be able to process what happened.
yeah.
And right now, bizarrely, it's in a safe environment, because, I can only imagine that particularly in the United States, COVID's getting worse. So I don't know, we'll see, but I'm looking forward to it. And and then we should have another conversation at the end of that that year, we'll see.
Person.
Sorry.
I said I'll come visit and we can do it in person, and hopefully we'll be back past the point of not being able to see anybody else in person.
Exactly, exactly. Oh man, but thank you for this.
Yeah. I feel like we could speak for hours longer, but
Yeah, we probably could, but I think this is a good amount. And this was really fun. This was a great idea. Thank you.
thank you. Super fun.
All right. Chat in a second.